He once thought war was a thing that belonged to old black and white photographs, tucked away in forgotten books, and in the fading voices of elderly men who sat outside the corner store, telling stories no one fully believed he would see them in the afternoon sunlight, wearing caps with medals pinned to them pointing to the air as they described planes they had seen in the sky decades ago. His younger self would listen, but his mind would wander toward more immediate things, like what snack to buy with the few coins in his pocket, or what game he might play with friends after school. He could picture war only as a distant play performed on a stage, far beyond his reach, the kind of thing history teachers spoke of while pointing at a map with a wooden stick. His own life was built from moments so quiet and harmless that the idea of danger felt like a rumor. He lived in a small town where the streets curled lazily past old houses with peeling paint, where shopkeepers knew his name and asked about his family, where the loudest sound was the church bell on Sundays, and even the stray dogs slept in the sun without fear. He would walk home under the wide blue sky, thinking how nothing in his world could ever change in any way that mattered. The only war he knew came in flickering images on the television screen, the kind that showed faraway deserts with dust storms and armored trucks moving in slow lines. He would see the reporters standing in helmets and flak jackets, speaking with serious voices, but once the news ended, the images slipped from his mind like smoke. He thought of war as something people talked about at dinner tables, when they ran out of things to say, or something that belonged in the realm of politics, a realm he did not care for because it never touched his daily life. When he imagined danger, it was in the form of thunderstorms, or perhaps the occasional car crash that would gather the whole neighborhood in whispers. Nothing beyond that ever dared enter his world, and so he moved through life with a kind of unspoken trust that tomorrow would be the same as today, and the day after would be no different. He believed in that stability, without even knowing he believed in it. It was simply the air he breathed and the ground he walked on. He had no reason to think that stability could shatter, no reason to believe the world outside his own streets could ever spill into them, and so war remained a shape in the distance, a word more than a reality, something as untouchable as the moon. When he looked at those black and white photographs of young men in uniforms, standing stiff and proud, he felt no connection to them. Their expressions were foreign, their experiences unimaginable. He could not see himself in their faces. In truth, he never wanted to. That distance was a kind of shield. One he did not know he carried, a shield made of ignorance and comfort, one that kept the shadows of the world from creeping too close. But every shield has a moment where it breaks, and his moment was already making its way toward him, though he did not yet hear the footsteps. His days were filled with coffee shops, street markets, and the comfort of knowing danger was always somewhere else. He would wake to the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery on the corner, and the sound of bicycles rattling over cobblestones. Outside his window, the morning sun painted everything gold and soft, and he believed life would always look this way. The faces he saw each day were familiar, the same shopkeeper offering the same warm greeting, the same old man feeding pigeons in the square, the same children chasing a ragged ball across the street, while their laughter echoed between the buildings. He had a small photography studio near the edge of town, nothing grand, just a space with worn wooden floors and the faint scent of chemical developer clinging to the air. He spent his days capturing weddings, birthdays, and the occasional school portrait. Nothing dangerous, nothing extraordinary, and he liked it. That way his world felt balanced, as if invisible hands kept trouble away from their little corner of the earth. The town itself seemed immune to the storms of the outside world. Even when news of conflicts appeared on the television, they felt like weather reports for distant planets, words and images that could not pierce the invisible wall around them. He listened but never truly heard. He looked but never truly saw. When neighbors spoke of violence in faraway cities, he would nod politely, but inside he thought of it as theater, tragic and gripping, but still just a performance. Then came the letter, a plain envelope slipped under his studio door without a return address. Inside was a request from a magazine. He had once sent his work 2 years ago. They had an assignment in a distant land, a place he had only ever heard of in news bulletins and geography lessons. They wanted a photographer to capture the daily life of people living near a conflict zone. Not the war itself, but the human side of it, the markets, the children, the workers, the small fragments of normal life that existed alongside chaos. At first he felt a thrill. This was the kind of opportunity young photographers dreamed of. It meant travel, new cultures, new faces. It meant his work could be seen by thousands, maybe even more, he told himself. It was harmless work, far from the front lines. He would be safe with guides and translators. He would simply be an observer, and then return home with stories and images that would impress everyone. He knew the decision felt easy as if his mind could not imagine any real danger. He packed his cameras, his lenses, his notebooks, all the familiar tools of his trade. He thought about the smell of foreign spices in street markets, about the faces he would photograph, about the way the light might fall on unfamiliar buildings. He told his friends he would be fine, that the stories on television always made things look worse than they were. He promised to return with pictures that would make them see the world differently. What he did not know was that the world he was about to enter would make him see himself differently, and once his eyes were opened, they would never close in the same way again. The plane landed with a shudder on a cracked runway, and the moment he stepped out, he felt the air was heavier than anything he had known before. The sun was bright, but it did not feel warm. It burned in a way that made the skin itch, and the horizon shimmer with heat waves. His first breath was thick with dust and something else, a faint metallic temps that lingered on his tongue. The airport was small and crowded with men in uniforms who eyed every passenger with suspicion, their rifles slung casually yet always within reach. He was met by a driver arranged by the magazine, a thin man with deep lines etched across his face, who spoke little, but whose eyes seemed to see everything. The car was an old Jeep with dents along its doors and a cracked windshield. They drove through streets that looked alive with contradictions. In one moment he saw women carrying baskets of fruit through the market, and children chasing a ball between the stalls, and in the next he passed walls pitted with bullet holes and shop fronts with shattered windows patched with cardboard everywhere. He looked. There were signs of something invisible, but close in absence in the faces of people who avoided eye contact, a stiffness in the way they moved, as if every sound made them ready to run. He took photographs from the Jeep, at first focusing on the colors, the textures, the way life persisted in the middle of weariness, but the longer they drove, the more he saw the tension hiding in every frame. The driver spoke at last, pointing to a row of buildings at the edge of the city. They had been a school once, but now they were abandoned, their windows dark, their walls stained with soot beyond them. The road narrowed and checkpoints appeared, groups of soldiers stopping vehicles, searching bags, speaking in quick, sharp voices. He was waved through after the driver showed a folded piece of paper, but he noticed the soldiers studied his face as if trying to decide what to make of him. The hotel was small, with peeling paint and a generator that hummed through the night. His room smelled faintly of smoke, though there was no fire, and the curtains were too thin to keep out the light from the street below, where shadows moved at all hours. He unpacked his camera gear with the care of a ritual, lining up lenses and memory cards, as if their order could anchor him in this place. From his window, he could see a hill in the distance dotted with clusters of houses, some with roofs missing, others leaning as if pushed by an unseen hand. Now and then, a distant rumble rolled across the air, too low and far to be certain, but enough to make his chest tighten. He told himself it was thunder, though the sky was perfectly clear. He picked up his camera and tried to focus on the market below, but the faces there did not smile, and every gesture felt hurried. He realized that war might not just be on the horizon. It might already be here, breathing somewhere just out of sight, waiting for the moment to step into view. The morning began quietly, with the smell of fried bread drifting up from the market below, and the sound of vendors calling out in the narrow street. He stepped out with his camera slung across his chest, ready to capture more scenes of daily life. He told himself today would be like yesterday, a walk through markets, a few portraits maybe, some children playing, but something in the air felt different. The voices of the vendors were not as loud, and the footsteps of the shoppers seemed quicker, as if everyone wanted to finish early. He followed the driver through winding streets lined with stalls selling vegetables, bolts of cloth, and jars of spices. The colors were vivid and the smells rich, but beneath it all he caught the faint scent of smoke, not from cooking fires but from something harsher. He paused to frame a photograph of a woman arranging dates in a basket, her hands steady, her eyes fixed on the fruit as if refusing to look anywhere else. A sharp crack echoed through the air like the snapping of a giant branch, and every head in the market turned toward the sound. The driver put a hand on his shoulder and told him to move quickly, though his voice remained calm. They ducked into a narrow side street just as another crack split the air, followed by a deeper boom that made the ground tremble. A cart overturned, spilling oranges across the stones, and a man hurried to gather them, even as people began to scatter. Someone shouted words he could not understand, and the sound of running feet filled the space around him. They reached an alley where the driver pushed him against a wall and signaled for him to stay low from somewhere. Beyond the rooftops came the pounding rhythm of gunfire. Short bursts followed by silence, then another burst. The silence in between felt heavier than the noise. He lifted his camera on instinct, snapping a shot of the empty street, but his hands trembled and the image came out blurred. A boy darted past, clutching a loaf of bread, his small bare feet slapping against the ground behind him. A woman hurried, with a bundle wrapped in cloth pressed tight to her chest, her eyes wide and searching. The driver signaled again, and they moved along the back streets, avoiding the main road where the noise grew louder with each step. At one corner, he risked a glance and saw a column of smoke rising beyond the market. The air shimmered with heat, and the faint metallic taste returned to his mouth. Soldiers were moving quickly along, the street rifles ready, their faces expressionless. One of them shouted toward the rooftops, and the sound of boots thudded overhead. He realized he was holding his breath without meaning to. When they reached the hotel, the driver locked the door behind them and did not speak for a long moment. He only listened, his head tilted toward the street outside. Finally he said quietly that the fighting had moved closer and that they would not be going out again until it passed, but the look in his eyes told him that passing might not come so easily. The hours passed slowly in the dim room, the hum of the generator blending with the muffled sounds of the street. He sat by the window with his camera on the table beside him, but for once he did not feel the urge to pick it up. The lens no longer seemed like a safe shield between him and the world outside. Instead, it felt like a fragile piece of glass that could break if the wrong thing happened. He watched people moving along the street below, but now he noticed every detail in a way he had not before. The way a man glanced over his shoulder 3 times before crossing the road, the way 2 women paused to speak, but kept their bodies angled away from the open space, the way children no longer chased each other in wide loops but kept close to doorways and shadows. When the driver returned in the late afternoon, he carried bread and a small packet of tea. He set them down on the table and told him the market was open again, but quieter, and fewer stalls had returned. The rest were gone, closed or abandoned, perhaps until it was safe again. If such a time came. The driver spoke little, but his words carried weight, and in the pauses between them there seemed to be more meaning than in the sentences themselves. He decided to walk to the edge of the neighborhood before the sun set. The driver warned him to stay in the main streets, but even there he could see the changes. Some buildings were shut with heavy boards, others had curtains drawn tight, and still others had scorch marks along their walls. He took a photograph of a faded mural on a crumbling wall, showing children holding hands there, paint peeling away in flakes like dried leaves, and for the first time he felt the image pressing against him rather than him pressing the shutter to capture it. A boy approached, holding a tray of small cakes wrapped in paper, and offered one. With a shy smile, his instinct was to buy it and thank him, but he realized the boy's eyes kept flicking toward the rooftops, as if expecting something to appear there. He took the cake and gave him money anyway, and as the boy walked away, he noticed the faint outline of dust across his back, as if he had been lying flat somewhere, hiding. He returned to the hotel as the sun bled into the horizon, turning the streets into long pools of shadow. From somewhere far off came the deep rolling sound he had heard before, not thunder, not this time. Now he could recognize it as the dull voice of artillery speaking from beyond the hills. It was not constant, but it came in intervals, each one pulling at the air like a slow tide. That night he lay on the narrow bed, unable to sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces from the street, and each one seemed to be holding back something they would never say aloud, and he began to wonder if the photographs he had come here to take were not the real story at all. The morning came with a haze that turned the light pale and flat. The driver knocked on his door before breakfast and told him they would travel to a nearby village, where the magazine wanted photographs of the local school. It was still open, despite the fighting, and the editors thought it would show resilience. He agreed, though a quiet unease settled in his stomach. He packed his cameras and a bottle of water and followed the driver to the jeep. The streets were emptier than the day before. Even the stray dogs kept close to walls. They drove past checkpoints where soldiers inspected their papers more carefully than before. Their eyes lingered on his face and his camera bag. At one checkpoint, a soldier asked the driver a long question, then tapped the barrel of his rifle twice against the jeep before waving them through. The driver did not explain what was said, and he did not ask. The road narrowed into a dirt track lined with fields that looked abandoned. The soil was dry and scattered with fragments of rusted metal here and there. The driver slowed the jeep and pointed toward a low ridge in the distance, saying the village was just beyond it. The sound came suddenly from somewhere far off, a deep thud, followed by a faint echo. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel, but he kept going. When they reached the village, its was smaller than he expected, a cluster of houses with tin roofs and walls the color of dust. Children watched from doorways, their faces both curious and wary. The school was a single building with cracks along its walls, but inside he found desks, neatly arranged, and a chalkboard filled with lessons in looping handwriting. The teacher welcomed him with a careful smile and gestured for the children to stay seated while he took photographs. As he moved from desk to desk, he began to hear the noise again, distant but steady, a low rhythm, like someone knocking on a heavy door. The children did not flinch, and the teacher did not pause her lesson. It was clear they had heard it many times before, but for him, each sound seemed closer, each vibration more certain. He stepped outside to photograph the building from the road, when a sudden burst of sharper noise cut through the air, followed by shouting from the far side of the village. The driver appeared at his side, speaking quickly in a voice that left no room for argument. They were leaving now. The children stayed inside, the teacher closing the door behind them, as if sealing a box. They climbed into the jeep and the driver turned it around so fast the tires sprayed dust into the air behind them. The sharper noises continued in uneven bursts, and he realized they were no longer distant. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept looking over his shoulder at the shrinking image of the school until it disappeared behind the ridge. The road back toward the city felt longer than before. The driver kept the jeep moving fast, but the sound of gunfire followed them, like a shadow, sometimes fading, sometimes flaring louder. As if chasing their wheels, he gripped the doorframe with one hand, his camera bag pressed to his side, his mind fixed on the image of the school fading behind the ridge, the children still inside, and the teacher's calm face closing the door. The driver said nothing, his eyes locked on the road ahead, the muscles in his jaw tight. They passed the first checkpoint without slowing, the soldiers waving them through with hurried gestures as if they wanted nothing to do with what was coming from behind. The second checkpoint was different. The soldiers there stood tense, their weapons raised, scanning the hills. As the jeep approached, one of them stepped forward and signaled for the driver to stop. He spoke quickly, in a tone that carried urgency, even without understanding the words. The driver nodded sharply, then told him they had to take a different route. The main road was no longer safe. The new route wound through narrow dirt paths between low hills. The sky above had turned a pale gray, and the air carried a faint, bitter smell that made the back of his throat ache. The jeep jolted over ruts and stones, and every bounce seemed to push the noise from behind closer. The bursts of sound now mixed with deeper rolling thuds that made the ground shiver beneath the tires. They came round a bend and saw another vehicle ahead, stopped in the middle of the path, its front door open. A suitcase lay on the ground beside it, clothes scattered like fallen leaves. The driver slowed but did not stop. He glanced at the empty road to either side, then pressed the accelerator again. The vehicle disappeared behind them, and he tried not to think about where its passengers had gone. The first explosion landed close enough to make the jeep lurch sideways, a cloud of dust swallowing the view. The driver shouted something and forced the jeep forward through the haze. His own ears rang, and for a moment, the world felt distant, as if wrapped in cotton. When the sound returned, it came all at once, the rattle of gunfire, the grind of the engine, the pounding of his own heartbeat. They reached a cluster of ruined buildings, and the driver pulled the jeep in under the shadow of a collapsed wall, telling him to stay low. They waited there. As the noise outside swelled and then ebbed again, he could see the driver's eyes shifting left and right, following sounds he could not yet place. His fingers were tight around the steering wheel, though the engine was off. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, he could not tell, and then the driver said it was time to move. The city was not far, but the road would not be easy. He picked up his camera, but for the first time since arriving, he did not want to take a single picture. The jeep moved cautiously through the rubble-strewn streets, the driver's eyes sharp, scanning every corner and shadow. The roar of distant artillery still thrummed like a warning beneath the steady crack of rifle fire. Nearby, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a drum calling him to alertness. His fingers clutched the edge of the seat as the vehicle slowed near a cluster of damaged buildings. Smoke curled into the sky in thick black ribbons, and the air was heavy with the acrid scent of burning rubber and dust. Suddenly, a sharp crack sounded from a shattered window, and a soldier appeared, firing toward an unseen enemy. The jeep jerked as the driver swerved to avoid the bullets flying past them. Glass shattered, raining down like cold rain on the dashboard. He pressed himself low, feeling the tension knotting inside him. The photographer's camera hung heavy at his side, a reminder of everything he had hoped to record before the war had become so real. They sped through a narrow alley, where the walls bore fresh scorch marks and the ground was littered with spent shells and broken weapons. The sounds of shouting echoed from nearby alleys. The world was no longer a distant story but a brutal and living nightmare pressed tight around him. His breath caught as a group of soldiers ran past the jeep, their faces set with grim determination and eyes burning with exhaustion and fear. In the chaos, a stray bullet struck a nearby wall, sending a shower of dust and small stones over the jeep. The driver cursed under his breath and kept moving, but the danger seemed to close from all sides. Suddenly the jeep hit a pothole and lurched, throwing them both forward. He gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the sweat running down his back and the taste of dust in his mouth. He looked out the window and saw a small child frozen in place, clutching a tattered doll, the child's eyes wide and unblinking. As the jeep passed by, the image seared into his mind, as if branded there forever. For a moment, the camera slipped from his hand and he caught it just before it hit the floor. The driver glanced over and said to stay low and keep quiet. The photographer nodded, his voice caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. The world seemed to tilt and shake as another explosion rocked the street nearby, sending a thunderous wave through the buildings. The air filled with screams and the sharp scent of gunpowder. He felt the heat of flames licking the edge of his vision and heard the cries of people caught between nowhere and somewhere. The photographer realized he was no longer a mere observer. The fury of war had found him in the narrow, dusty streets, and it would not let him go. The jeep came to a sudden halt. The driver slammed on the brakes and they both were thrown forward against their seatbelts. The world outside was chaos, smoke and dust mixed with screams and the sharp smell of burning metal. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. The camera hung heavy around his neck, its weight now a burden, not a tool. He looked toward the driver, whose face was set in grim determination, eyes scanning the street for an opening. The engine idled low. The driver whispered words he did not understand, but the tone was urgent. It was time to move now or never. The photographer felt the surge of fear like a tide crashing over him, but beneath it there was something new, a fierce stubbornness to survive, to tell the story, not just through pictures, but through living. The driver nodded toward a narrow alleyway, framed by crumbling walls and tangled wires, a path that looked dangerous, but maybe safer than the open street. He gripped his camera tighter despite the noise, the fear, the uncertain future. He stepped out into the narrow passage, the ground uneven underfoot and the air thick with dust and smoke. He moved fast, keeping low, his eyes darting for any sign of movement. The sounds of gunfire and shouting echoed close behind him, but he focused on each step, on each breath. A sudden cry pierced the air, a child's voice filled with fear and pain. He turned toward a collapsed wall where a small figure lay, half hidden beneath rubble. His heart stopped for a moment, then pushed him forward. He dropped his bag and with trembling hands began to pull away stones and broken wood. The child coughed and reached out, grasping his fingers, a silent plea for help that shattered the space around him. The driver appeared beside him, pulling the photographer back as bullets zipped past like angry hornets. They dragged the child to safety behind a battered door, where a few others huddled, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. The photographer wrapped the child's small hand in his scarf, feeling the fragile life trembling beneath his touch. The world had become raw and immediate, no longer distant news or images, but a harsh reality beating inside his chest. Later, as the fighting ebbed and the night crept over the city, he sat alone in the dim room, the child asleep in a corner, the camera resting beside him. He looked at the images he had taken, not the perfect shots, the kind that told stories from a distance, but the broken fragments, the blurred moments, the faces frozen in fear and hope. He realized that war was no longer distant. It had found him and changed him forever. He thought of the life he had left behind, the peaceful streets, the warm mornings, the comfortable distance from violence, and he understood now that there was no going back. The fury he had witnessed face to face had opened his eyes to something deeper, a truth too raw to capture with any lens but impossible to forget.